So last video I talked about National Novel Writing Month and reasons for doing it. So this video I'm going to talk about the things that you can do beforehand. First coming up with your idea and then planning if you feel so inclined to do so. Not everybody does. Not everybody who does NaNoWriMo is going to be doing a completely brand new story. Sometimes they'll be carrying on a story that they've already written a part of, and really the only rule is that you have to write 50,000 words of new material. But most people, they are going to be starting from scratch on a brand new story. So, of course, you've got to come up with an idea. What are you going to write about? Sometimes you get so many ideas that you can't pick just one, and other times it's really hard to think of anything at all. So here are my own tips for coming up with ideas for your story. Now, I'm a great believer in the old saying, write what you know. So think about something that you're interested in or that you know a lot about and see if you can write a story about it. If you're interested in some kind of historical subject, you write some historical fiction. If you're interested in science, you can write science fiction. Maybe you could think of a story about the job that you do. Alternatively, you can write the story that you would want to read. Think about your favourite stories and then think about just what it is you like about them. Is it a particular kind of character? Is it a setting? Do you like books about travel? Do you like action? Do you like romance? If you can't find a perfect story for yourself in the bookstore, then write it yourself. A good idea is to gradually build a notebook of potential ideas and just fill it with things that might inspire you to make a story one day. Maybe something you see on the news, something interesting that happened to you or happened to a friend, some little thing that you read about. Then you can go back to this notebook when you're stuck and it might inspire you. Sometimes you might find a scene in another story or an image in a television program which might inspire a story that's completely different from what the original source was. That's what happened with me with my 2012 NaNoWriMo. Sometimes a particular bit of music can give you an idea for a scene that would fit particularly well with it. Or on the other hand, you can think of stories that you didn't like for whatever reason. Was there a particular kind of character that you get tired of, some kind of cliche? And you look at that and think, how would I have done that differently? And then create a story from there. So once you've got the basic idea of what it is you're going to write about, you need to decide whether you're what NaNoWriMo participants call a plotter or a pantser. That is, are you going to plan out an outline of the story beforehand, or are you just going to get writing and see where the story takes you? Ultimately, what method you go for is dependent upon you and what makes you most comfortable and is going to get the most words out of you. And personally, I'm definitely a plotter. I find it really hard to get going without some sort of outline of what I'm doing. But if you are going to make an outline, then how do you go about doing that? There are many, many different methods, and ultimately there's no correct one. Again, it all depends on what works for you. You just experiment with a few and see where it gets you. And my personal favourite is the Snowflake Method, which was created by Randy Ingemanson. It's called the Snowflake Method because it builds a story in the same way as the formation of a snowflake. You start out very simple and then gradually become more and more complex as you go. I'll put a link in the description to a web page that gives more details about the Snowflake Method. But basically the gist of it is you start off by summarising your story in a single sentence of 15 words or less. The next step is to make a paragraph of 5 sentences describing your story. So the first sentence will be the beginning. The next 3 sentences involve the meat of the story. Each one should end with some kind of disaster. And the 5th one is how the story ends. The next step is to map out your main characters and then talk about their traits and their goals and what motivates them and a 1-sentence summary of what their role is in the story. Then after that, you take your 1-paragraph summary that you've created and you take each of the sentences in that and you turn that into a paragraph. So you see how you mean about becoming more and more complex. And then you go on from there. Now, when I'm planning a story, I don't personally use every single step of the Snowflake Method. I do about the first 5 or 6, which is usually enough to see me through NaNoWriMo, but it is definitely a really great way to get started. Another method that I like is the 7-point structure, which I first saw in a series of videos by Dan Wells. Again, I'll put a link to those in the description. And basically that involves making the skeleton of a story out of 7 stages. First there's the hook where everything begins, the first plot turn where the status quo changes and the story gets going, the pinch which applies pressure to the protagonist, the midpoint where you start moving towards the ending when the protagonist stops reacting to what's been happening and then starts actually acting for themselves. Then there's the second pinch where something happens that looks like it's going to prevent the protagonist from achieving their goal. The second plot turn where the protagonist gets whatever it is they need to achieve their goal. And the resolution, which is how everything ends. Alternatively, you can kind of make a list of scenes that are going to happen in your novel by brainstorming. Maybe make a spider diagram with your premise in the middle and then draw points out of that based on sources of conflict or interesting things that can come out of that premise. or make lists of things that you think are going to happen or that you want to see happen in your story and sort them into an appropriate order. Basically, the most important thing you should know going into your story is what the conflict is and what it is your protagonist wants to achieve, because that is what's going to keep the story moving and make it interesting. And then once you've got an idea of what you're going to be writing about and what's going to happen, you can do whatever research you need to do, whatever it is you need to know more about for authentic details. So while it can be a bit hard to come up with the initial idea for your story, I personally find that the planning section and the research section of things are quite a lot of fun. And then November starts and you're going to get onto the writing, which is going to be fun some days, but not others. So my next video I'm going to talk about November itself and give a few tips for just how to get through those 30 days. So tune in then, and thanks for watching.